Good morning, my girls. So today I have some screencasts about genetics, so that you guys can at least get a taste of genetics before the school year is over, and learn how to use a Punnett square. So with this unit, we are going to talk about Gregor Mendel, who is considered the father of modern day genetics because he was the first person to really do well-rounded experiments that really showed how different characteristics are inherited from our parents. So on this slide I just have some pictures of some dogs. The one on the bottom is Buddha, and then also of some eye color so that you can kind of see just some things that we look at when we are talking about genetics. So before we get talking about genetics in terms of modern day genetics, we kind of have to talk about some of the overarching ideas that were put forth about how things were passed to onto offspring. So the first theory that was really popular at the time was pangenesis, which basically says that there are these particles from the somatic cells that somehow move to the gametes, and then that's how the traits get passed on. That's not true. There's not little pieces of your body cell. It's not like there's a piece of your skin cell going to a gamete to say, here's how you do a skin cell. That's not what's happening. We know it's the DNA, but they did not know that it was the DNA that was passing at this time. And then the other hypothesis was blending. And blending I can kind of understand a little bit better how they thought this was a thing. Basically they thought if you would mix traits, you could, like if you mix two different things, the traits would mix together like putting like chocolate syrup or like strawberry syrup into milk and then getting it to turn purple, LOL, not purple, brown or pink. Or another example would be like if you took a black dog and a brown dog and you mated them, then you would get a dark brown dog. That is not what happens, though you'll see in a little while there are some circumstances that happen that kind of make blending look like it's a thing, but I'll explain in a little while when that slide presents itself. I'll explain why blending is not the case, even though it sometimes looks like it. Okay, so this is showing you, this picture is showing the idea of pangenesis, that the body cells somehow gave pieces that they called gemmules to the egg, and then once the egg was fertilized, you had the development of the embryo using all of these gemmules from the body cells. Again, that's not what happens. You now know about meiosis, so you should be an old pro. So let's talk about Gregor Mendel. He was a monk, and he was a very, very smart monk. He studied physics, he studied math, and he studied chemistry. So to say he was smart is a little bit of an understatement. But he also studied biology, really because he liked math. So you'll see. Well, I guess really we won't have time to talk all about the math that he figured out, but he did a lot of math to figure out these genetics. And he was the first person, or at least he's the first recorded person to say that you get heritable factors from your parents. Now we now know that those heritable factors are genes, but he didn't know they were genes at the time. That name didn't exist yet, so he just called them heritable factors. And it turns out he was right, so yay, Gregor. So just a couple of definitions. Heredity is the definition or the word that we use to describe the transmission of traits from one generation to the next. So like from your parents to you, that's one generation, and then from you to your kids eventually, that will be another generation. So how are traits passed from one generation of offspring to the next? And then genetics is the study of heredity. So studying how traits are transmitted from one generation to the next. So Mendel basically did a giant science fair project studying garden peas, basically to figure out that these heritable factors are going to retain their individuality generation after generation, despite if they actually appear in one generation or the other. So I think I've mentioned this before, but what that's trying to say is like how someone in your family might say, oh, you look just like your grandpa, or oh, you look just like your grandma. So basically, your parent might not have a specific trait, but they have the genes for that trait. They just don't show that trait because some genes are seen more often than others. You may have heard of dominant and recessive. But then by the time it gets to you, when your parents have you, well, then that trait can potentially reappear depending on your mom or your dad's partner that they end up having a child with. A trait may reappear. That's dominant and recessive. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So why did Mendel choose to study garden peas? That is because really there's a lot of reasons. One of them is that they're kind of like fast plants, and you can get one generation to the next incredibly quickly. They have things that are really easy to follow, like the color of the flowers, the color of the seeds, how tall the flowers are, how short they are, the pod color, the pod texture. There's a lot of traits in a pea plant that are really easy to just like look at and see with your eyeballs. So it's not like you have to do any type of genetic testing to figure out what trait is being shown. So that's really cool that he thought to do that. The things that he was able to easily track are called characters, and the characters are going to vary among individuals. And then that variation within a character is called a trait. So I have some examples down below. Pause it for a second and see if you can figure out which one is the character and which one is the trait. Go ahead and italicize the character and bold the trait. Okay, so for the first one, eye color and the color of your eyes, the character is going to be eye color. Everyone has that character, but there's a variation in that character called a trait. That would be the color of your eyes. The actual color your eyes end up being is the trait. Hair color and the color of your hair. The hair color is going to be the character, and the color of your hair is going to be the trait for that character. Number 3, your hairline and the shape of your hairline. So everyone has a hairline, so that's the character. And then the shape of your hairline is the trait. So you may have heard of like a widow's peak. That would be the shape of your hairline. Some people have it, some people don't. If you've never heard of a widow's peak, it is probably because you do not have one. Google it. It's when they have like that point in the center of their forehead where their hair comes from. And then the 4th one, earlobes and whether they are attached or not. So the character would be earlobes because everyone has earlobes, but the trait would be whether they are attached to the skin on your cheek/jaw or if they are not. So that might be kind of hard for you to tell just by feeling. So you may want to look in the mirror, or if your brother or sister or mom or dad is around, you can ask them to look. If you don't know if you're attached or separated, then Google some pictures of it and you'll get a better idea of if yours are attached or not. But those are all things that are genetic. Those are characters that have variation within them that we call a trait. But the best reason for choosing garden peas for his experiments is that he could deliberately mate certain pairs. So he could basically decide like, hey, if I want to know what happens if I take 2 purple flowers and mate them together and see what their offspring look like, he could. If he wanted to see what 2 white flowers looked like when they were mated together, he could. If he wanted to see what would happen if he had 2 pea plants that create green peas, because there's also yellow, that's the other trait. So pea color would be the character, and then whether it's yellow or green would be the trait. But he could do all of those things. He could intentionally mate whichever pairs of flowers he wanted, which is a big deal because, like, for example, it's like not ethical to study this in people because you can't force people to have babies with people they don't want to have babies with. And furthermore, you can't force people to have multiple babies with someone that they don't want to have babies with. That is unethical. But with these flowers, he could deliberately choose who is going to be mating with who, because plants don't have brains, so they don't have feelings. So how was he able to easily control it? He could control if plants self-fertilized, which, yes, is a thing. Plants do oftentimes self-fertilize. And if he wanted them to do that, all he had to do was cover this part right here, the carpel. It's the center part. All he had to do was cover it with a little bag to prevent, and that's like the carpel. I guess we haven't done flower parts, huh? The carpel is the female part of the flower, and then the stamens, these like little line things over here with a little arrowhead looking thing, that's the male part of the egg. The male part of the flower is the stamen. And so basically, if he wanted to make sure that it's self-fertilized, all he would do was cover the carpel to where no other pollen from any other flowers could land on it. And then he could just intentionally take the pollen from these stamens and he could like rub it under the baggie to make sure that that plant was self-fertilizing. If he wanted them to cross-fertilize, meaning to fertilize the flowers next to them or some other flowers of his choice, what he would do was remove the male part. He would remove the stamens. That way he could control and make sure that there's no pollen that's like blowing in the wind or any animals or anything like that that are taking that pollen and cross-fertilizing all kinds of plants. He would remove the stamens and he would intentionally pollinate only the carpel of the flowers that he wanted to. So he was able to control it because of the anatomy of the pea plants. So basically, after he fertilized whichever plants he wanted to fertilize, the carpel would then mature into a pea pod, aka seeds, and then he was able to plant those peas, and then he was able to look at that next generation of plants to see how they were going to look. So he was able to control who the parents were, and then he was able to study specifically those two parents' children, those two parents' offspring, to see exactly what was going on. So his experimental design was that basically once he knew that he could control the parentage of the plant, so he did some experiments before he even did his actual experimenting. Once he knew that he was controlling who the parents were, he was able to do his real actual experiments that he wanted to do. He started with 7 different characters that the pea plants have, that each have 2 and only 2 distinct traits. So they either had purple or white flowers. They had green or yellow pods. They had wrinkled or smooth seeds. They were tall plants or they were short plants. There's only 2 different traits for these 7 different characters. And so he took those plants and he mated them over and over and over and over deliberately until he was sure he had what we called a true breeding variety. So in a true breeding plant, self-fertilization, so if he covered the carpels with the baggie and used the pollen from the same flower to fertilize, it would always lead to offspring that were identical to the parent. So he would cross purple flower against purple flower like 10 times, and then like 10 generations worth of purple flower to purple flower. And then finally he knew, okay, if I cross this purple flower with itself, it's definitely going to make a purple flower. Same thing with the white flowers. He would do white flower against white flower for 10 or so generations. And as soon as he knew for sure that if that white flower self-fertilized itself, it would turn into a white flower, then he would use those varieties to do his actual experiments, which I will pick up on in the next screencast. So a true breeding plant or a true breeding variety is one that when self-fertilization occurs, the offspring that you get are going to be identical to the parent plant every single time. There are plants that are not true breeding, which do not lead to an identical offspring every time, but he used ones that were identical every time.